Hello, and welcome to our closing panel discussion for this half-day seminar on reducing cloud risk, what you haven't thought of yet. Today's panel is called Sweeping the Area, Cleaning Our Cloud Risk to Maintain Business Continuity. As a reminder, this session is being recorded. The recording will be made available in the virtual environment. Our panel of guests will be taking questions at the end, so please submit your questions through the Q&A feature below. I'd now like to turn it over to Christy Westfall to get started.
Thank you, Casey. Yes, I'm Christy Westfall, and it's really been a pleasure to help in the coordination of today's programming. I hope everyone has gotten a little bit or a lot of bits to take home with them, because I've certainly learned a lot. This topic of business continuity seemed to be an appropriate ending for our event today, because it really ties all these themes that we've talked about together, plus it gives us even more to consider. So I'm really excited to hear more from our speakers today about some questions I'm going to pose to them. So I know many of you have attended their sessions, but I'd like to ask each of the panelists to quickly introduce themselves, and then I'll jump in with the questions. So let's start with Charles.
Hi, everyone. My name is Charles DeBeck. I'm a cyber threat intelligence expert at IBM and excited to be here today talking to you about cloud security. Thanks.
Thanks, Charles. Let's go to Roger, please.
All right. Thank you very much. My name is Roger O'Farrell. I'm an information security manager in the financial sector, and I love all the things cloud, and happy to help here today.
Awesome. Thanks, Roger. Niles.
Hello, everyone. So happy to join everyone today during this conference. And my name is Niles, as you've heard, and I currently drive cloud security adoption for Cisco.
Excellent. And last but certainly not least, Michelle.
Hello, everyone. My name is Michelle Smith, and I'm a product lead for cloud security and privacy on Google Cloud Platform. And I'm excited to be here today to talk to you about privacy and risk management.
Well, that is a great segue into our first question. So I'm going to start with you, Michelle. What does a comprehensive cloud risk program look like? It's hard for me to wrap my head around that. What specific risks and point solutions should we consider?
So I think there's a couple of things when you think about a cloud risk program that's a little bit different. And I'm coming from an infrastructure as a service perspective, but it also varies depending on what type of model you're using. There's a shared responsibility between the customer and the cloud provider. And as you'll see, as you go through different models, like if you're using a software as a service model, the cloud vendor will take on way more of that responsibility than a model where you're as an infrastructure as a service, where a lot more responsibility is with the customer or equally shared between the cloud provider. And so when you're making a comprehensive risk program, you really have to start to look at across the different areas of risk, whether you're thinking about business continuity, security, privacy, what is the shared responsibility model? How much is my responsibility? How much is the cloud provider's responsibility? And when it comes to the cloud provider's responsibility, you need to understand, how are they measuring that responsibility? Are there frameworks that they're using that are specifically developed for the cloud? Because there are some frameworks out there that stipulate things that don't really apply in a cloud computing environment. So you have to look at those frameworks. How do they certify against those frameworks? Are there attestations available as you're starting to build up the information that you're going to use to inform how much risk you're taking on by choosing that cloud provider? The other thing that you should really think about is, what data or what assets am I going to put into the cloud provider? That's definitely going to determine what type of risk framework you have for that cloud provider. So if you're going to put some of your more sensitive assets that are heavily regulated, let's say something like personally identifiable information or health information, you'll find that your risk tolerance is going to be much lower than if you were doing something like aggregated data that doesn't have any sensitive nature to it. So that's the other thing that you have to think about, and what's going to be the impact to your business if any of the risk materialize. And you can use a very rudimentary impact model like CIA, if you've heard of it, confidentiality, integrity, availability. What are those kind of impacts? Or you could do something a lot more granular based on like your control data. And then I would say the final thing that I would consider when thinking about building a comprehensive program on the cloud provider is that data scales so much. Like there's so many things that people will just throw into a cloud once you start using the cloud provider, whether it's a SaaS or a PaaS or IaaS, whatever the model is. People in your organization are just going to start putting a lot of data there. And you're going to want to have a governance program that starts to lean towards the automated side so that you can scale. Because you're going to want to make sure that you understand what assets are there, right? Asset inventory is a key part of any risk program, any security program. You have to know what assets you're trying to protect, right? You're going to have to know how they're accessed, how they're deployed, what security configurations and controls. And in order to keep up with that, you're going to have to start looking at some automated governance models so that you can fully have a comprehensive cloud risk program.
Wow, that's a lot. Thank you for that, Michelle. Charles, would you like to weigh in on that?
Sure, and I'm not sure how much I can necessarily add here. That was a very comprehensive answer by Michelle, so a lot of great information there that I absolutely agree with. I tend to look at things from a more tactical level, being a threat intelligence guy. That tends to be more my area of expertise. And when I'm thinking about how to make a comprehensive program for a cloud environment, I think from a cybersecurity perspective, which I think directly impacts sort of the risk perspective, my biggest thing is cloud specificity and practice. And this was something that Michelle also touched on, which is, you need to make sure you have a cloud-specific governance structure for your risk. But from a cybersecurity perspective, you need to make sure that you have a cloud-specific plan for your incident response and for potential, data incidents that occur in the cloud or involving your cloud environment. A lot of times I've talked to organizations and they have incident response plans in place, but they might not have one specifically designed for a cloud-based incident. And that can lead to a lot of potentially negative outcomes. So I think there's a lot of benefit to making sure that cloud specificity is built in across your overall security structure. And when you're looking at developing your incident response plans, making sure that cloud is incorporated into that as well with real intention, not just sort of on the side. In addition, I think that another key component to having a comprehensive plan is practicing, and this is a big point that I make to clients all the time. That having an incident response plan or having a cybersecurity plan in place for your cloud environment is good. But if you haven't tested that plan, if you haven't really engaged in an effective deep dive tabletop exercise or cyber range exercise for the organization, you're not going to know where the potential holes or pitfalls are. And this goes back to a point that, again, citing Michelle's comments here, depending on if you're using cloud for infrastructure as a service or software as a service versus, what have you as a service, there will be different components there that may play in. And based on that relationship, you might have to adjust your plan and tweak it in small ways to accommodate those different relationships. But you won't necessarily know exactly how to accommodate that or what exact changes to make until you test it. So my biggest recommendation to an organization that's looking around and saying, okay, we really want to be comprehensive here, is I would say, take all that great advice that Michelle just gave you and set up your initial comprehensive plan, but then test it. Make sure that you're running through exercises and running through scenarios to make sure that it's going to be effective when, if something occurs, and not just sort of in theory. So that's those are my main additions in addition to everything else that's already been said.
I like that. Yeah, it's definitely when something happens and we need to be prepared. So thank you for that, Charles. All right, so I'm gonna switch up questions here. And I'm going to start with Roger on this one. In what ways that you see currently can cloud providers help customers manage their portion of the risk portfolio, kind of going back to that shared responsibility model?
Right, excellent question. And I'm going to approach that from two separate areas. The first one, we need transparency from the providers. the veil of the cloud is unknown for a lot of companies out there. We're at a stage, even though the cloud keeps being adopted widely, a lot of people out there don't really understand what's happening behind the scenes. So we are assuming a certain amount of risk by letting the provider control some of the stuff behind the scenes. They're controlling the physical infrastructure and things like that. Our job as cloud consumers is going to be to question that, to ask questions. You know, the wise man said, trust but verify. That is what we need from the providers. We need to keep those communication channels open. And I know it might be a little bit difficult for big providers like AWS, Azure, et cetera. They sure cannot be responding to every single question out there. But what they are doing is publishing more information of what they're doing, how they're managing all that infrastructure, processes, all of that. And that gives assurance to the customers that things are being managed to the level that they're willing to accept. If we don't have that, if we don't see what's happening, we don't get any sort of response from our cloud service providers, well, we really can quantify the risk that we're assuming here. Like I said, for the bigger providers, that's not much of a problem because they have that in mind. They're putting documentation out there, their SOC reports and things like that, that kind of, gives you some assurance that somebody is validating what's happening. Then with that, we as customers can make decisions. Do I trust the vendor, yes or no, because they're doing X, Y, or Z? That's definitely something that we all should be doing. It might be a little bit of a problem when you talk about software as a service or some very small providers, but again, it's going to be our due diligence aspect to just be asking those questions and then make determinations from there on, can we live with this? So that's going to be for each one of us to answer. The other thing that the providers can do, it's education and training. There's still, like I said, a lot of unknown stuff. Maybe you went fast to the cloud, say we have to move to the cloud, and maybe those risk assessment parts were not analyzed in detail. We just had to move because we didn't want to renew some licenses on premise or something like that, and we said let's go to the cloud. So we need to work with our providers to understand what they offer, and all encompassing, not just from a technical perspective, but from you're regulated, you have to understand how your provider approaches that. You have to make sure what sort of training they're going to offer in different aspects. Remember, we're not talking just about your engineers. You need your stakeholders, management, audit, legal. All those people need to understand what is it that they're walking into, and they need to work with the provider to make sure that they have the right level of understanding of the cloud technologies that they're adopting.
Very practical approaches. I appreciate that. Thank you, Roger. Michelle, would you like to weigh in on that question?
Yeah, I think, Roger was spot on with the transparency and the education. I also think that there's some things that people, that cloud providers can do in product that I've already seen a lot of cloud providers starting to do that can help. One example is blueprints. Right. How do I set up a GKE, Google Kubernetes, but just any Kubernetes container instance in a way for that to ensure that my online retail app is compliant with PCI because I'm processing payment information? What does that look like? Can you give me a blueprint that tells me how should I set up my, identity and access management system? How should I set up my firewalls? How should I set up my networking? Can you walk me through this and give me like a blueprint that gets me started and gets me jump started? Because I may be coming directly from on-prem and going to the cloud, and I may not understand all the nuances, but you understand the features and the products that you built and how I should use it. So I see blueprints popping up across all the major hyperscalers to help with that. Another thing is recommendation services. And I think at this point, every major hyperscaler has that as well. There's like AWS Trusted Advisor, and GCP has the recommendation service. But the idea is that there are best practices. And this one is actually really interesting because they're not just best practices for security and compliance, which are really important, but there are also things like, cost efficient best practices. How can you make sure that you're not using up more VM capacity than you really need and making and running up your bill, right? So they have cost efficiency, security, compliance. I've seen kind of like feature discovery. Like we noticed that you're putting these 3 services together. It looks like you're trying to build a website. You probably should use these services instead, right? I've seen all kind of recommendations where they're just trying to help you be more efficient in the cloud. And I think that's another way that cloud providers in product can help. And then there's stuff that was already said by Roger in terms of like attestations and audit reports. I think almost every major cloud provider now has self-service audit reports. So you can just go and pull it down yourself. You don't have to go through some special process with the technical account sales manager and get it. You can just access it directly. And then they're also leveraging third-party vendors like the Cloud Security Alliance or BlackRock to run different types of security risk assessments and self-assessments across the cloud provider. That can also give you a deep insight into how they're protecting your data in the cloud. And I think those are the types of things that cloud providers can be doing in product as well to help make it easier for you to manage your risk on the cloud.
Wow, we keep getting better and better. Great ideas. Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate that. Niles, I'm also going to ask you to weigh in on this one.
All right, thanks. I was on mute there. Yeah, so Michelle and Roger brought up really, really great points about transparency and laying out a blueprint. And I think all of that goes back to the shared security model that we hear about all the time, the concept. What I would like to add into that is that not only that we're seeing people adopt public cloud, they're also shifting to multi-cloud. And so when you shift to multi-cloud, that means that you're going to be exposed to different kind of hardwares, different types of softwares and things of that nature. And so the idea of following closely to the shared security module becomes really difficult, not only from a services level, but from different multi-cloud level. And so just kind of, I would suggest that cloud service providers take the time to help give us a good picture about those gray areas, depending on the services that you are consuming, number one, and then also make sure that that data is digestible, right? I see a lot of like documentations online and they're like 400 pages long. And it's like, okay, well, who's gonna have that 8 hours to sit down and read? First of all, they don't even have, 8 hours for professional development. How are these engineers gonna have the time to, so just being able to take whatever your suggestions are, put it in a form that is digestible and make it available for the cloud consumers. Those are just a couple of things I would add.
Yes, but those 400-page reports make great insomnia cures. So no, I'm kidding. That you spot on there. I totally agree with you. You need to be able to apply what's being shared. So that's really important. Thank you. All right, so we're going to switch it up again. Next question, and Niles, we're going to start with you this time. We learn through our mistakes, but sometimes it's even better to learn through others' mistakes. What mistakes can you share with our audience today?
Wow, that's a great question. What mistakes that I have made can I share with others? So I cannot be 100% transparent here, but I can share with you an example for obvious reasons. But here's what I want to share. Oftentimes, take for instance, storage buckets. People don't really understand some of the knobs that they're seeing inside of their dashboard or their console, and they think they understand it, and they're utilizing these control settings. And what they don't understand or realize is that they're actually exposing themselves to vulnerability or opening up a backdoor for someone to possibly penetrate. Okay, so if we talk about the storage buckets, for instance, there's a knob that allows you to say, okay, this bucket is available for authenticated users. Okay, well, who are the authenticated users? In an average person's mind, you would immediately think people that I authenticate in my environment, in my enterprise, right? But when you actually look at it deeper to understand what that setting is telling you to do, it's saying these authenticated users are anyone who is authenticated from an Amazon Web services perspective. So not just your enterprise authentication matters here, but when you enable that authenticated users, you're basically opening up your entire tenant to everyone who can authenticate to storage bucket. And so that is a loophole that I see. So not understanding all what the knobs are doing inside the control setting matters. And so it's important to take the time to understand specific actions that you're taking and what those caveats or side effects, so to speak, are, and how that would affect your environment. And I would like to also add that tools matters. You know, when we're doing all of these things manually, we are just simply prone to errors. And I know that a couple of other people have talked about, you know, using automation and stuff like that. So it's incredibly important that you leverage automation as much as possible, and not just leverage, you know, automation, but do some audits to ensure that, you know, you're rechecking your permissions and things of that nature regularly, not just kind of configure it and walk away, but go back and check it and make sure that you're remediating as recommended per the tool. Okay, so that's all I'll have to add to that.
Wow, those, yeah, I'm just sitting here nodding my head. Yeah, we've talked about trust but verify more than once today, but that's so true. You got to understand what you're doing before you enable that. So thank you, Niles. I'm going to turn to Charles and ask that same question.
Yeah, and I got to say, once again here, Niles had a great response, and I was pretty much going to second everything she said. I'd say the mistake that I've seen most frequently in my experience is organizations have, you know, decent policies set up and decent, you know, risk frameworks in place for their cloud environment, and then somebody somewhere says, "Oh, I just need to spin a box up for a quick minute here." You know, what could go wrong? You know, I'm just going to just turn this on for 5 minutes. That's it. I mean, I'm sure we all have horror stories of one sort or another that sort of fall in that vein, but that tends to be what I see most frequently. And so I think when we're talking about, you know, what mistakes do we see having the biggest impact, I think that's got to be it for me, is that sort of one-off spin up that leads to a much more significant infection for the overall organization. And I think the solutions here are both policy and technical, and I think they really have to be both. I think you need to both have the policy in place and the employee training education in place to explain, you know, why you shouldn't do that sort of thing. Because I think most employees know they probably shouldn't do it, but they may not understand just how significant the consequences can be. And so I think there's an education component there, and making sure you have the policies in place to effectively bring action against employees that are doing things they aren't supposed to be within the organization is also important. But I also think there's a technical component here. I don't think that that organizations necessarily, this comes back again to the overall theme of trust but verify. You know, we have the policies in place, we put the education in place, and that's the trust component. But I think there's a technical component here of verifying, where you need to make sure that you have good internal detective controls in place to detect if things like this are coming online they're not supposed to. And you can also engage in effective internal segmentation to help reduce the impact if that sort of thing occurs. So I think that I think you really need both. You know, you can't just have just policy or just tech. You need both components of that equation to really be effective to help combat that type of mistake. Niles also talked about having the right tools. I 100% agree. That's something that I've seen as well, where organizations have good incident response tools in place, but they don't necessarily have cloud-based tools or tools that are effective in cloud environments. And that can lead to a slower incident response time. It can lead to the awkward moment where you just don't have the right tool for the job, and that ultimately can harm the organization more. So making sure you have the right tools in place and practicing with those tools, going back to my previous theme. And then automation, again, I know a few folks have talked about this, and I 100% agree that automation is a great way for organizations to more effectively, more quickly respond on average to incidents by using security automation. And I think it really makes a big difference. And when we're talking about cloud environments, which are generally, you know, very significant resources, very significant amounts of data, being able to quickly respond can make a big difference in many cases. So I think those three themes, I'm just saying I second everything Niles said. I think those are all very key ways to help improve overall security posture.
Awesome. Thank you, Charles. And I'll put in here that I'm glad I'm not answering this question, because if we talked about my mistakes, we'd be here all day. So let's change topics here. No, that's great, great thoughts. Thank you, Niles and Charles. Roger, I'm gonna go back to you. There are many unspoken assumptions underneath our layers of mitigation measures that imply very large scale risk. And I think we've touched on a few already today. But another example is, what happens if an entire region of a provider goes down? People laugh at that, but it's happened. How can people look actively for those risks to better mitigate?
Sure. If the region goes down, the answer is simple. We all go on a coffee break and just take it easy and relax. No, that's what some people would say, but it is a real risk. The problem that we see out there is that, again, in that accelerated path to the cloud, some people forget that could be an issue. You can spin up resources easily in one region, but when you talk about building that resiliency from the beginning, what happens if we lose the East Coast, if we lose the West, if we lose Asia, whatever region? The answer to that is we have to take it into consideration from day one. Ideally, when you were for modeling what would it look like to go to the cloud, you consider that. What happens if we lose a region? What happens if we lose our provider? Not an easy question to answer, because depending on your risk appetite, that may have different answers for everybody. The way that we mitigate this is by architecting our cloud solutions in the proper way. If you're worried that a region is going to go down, then you need to architect your platforms, your systems, your software, everything to be able to gracefully shift to another region in the event that something happens. We're in a good state of cloud nowadays. It's very advanced, very mature. So the solutions are going to be out there for us to do that. So we have to make sure if we're the architects and engineers doing that, we have to make sure that we are designing for that. If we are leaders, we have to be asking those questions. Do we know what's going to happen if US East 1 goes down or something like that? Will the application recover from that automatically? What's going to happen? If anybody's familiar, there's a solution that Netflix developed called Chaos Monkey, which is a tool that they deploy it and automatically starts shutting down things in their cloud platform, because they're that 100% sure that whatever goes down, it's not going to affect them. So they went through that exercise. Of course, they are an outlier because they're super mature in the cloud space. I wouldn't expect somebody who just got to the cloud to randomly start turning things on and off and see what happens. You have to have a level of assurance that your solutions were engineered and architected right to be able to do that. The other aspect of how we can mitigate this is what Niles said earlier: multi-cloud. If you really want to protect against maybe your provider going down, you need to look into multi-cloud. You need to be able to see how your solution is going to shift over to another provider. Not an easy thing. That one cloud provider is hard enough. 2 cloud providers or 3, it's just double, triple the problem. So you have to make sure that if you really want to go down this path, that you understand what each provider is bringing to the table, and that you have the capability to go ahead and adapt to how every single provider is going to do things. So again, decisions that we all have to discuss. There's going to be, based on the impact, the cost, all of that. We have to make those decisions based on whatever risk appetite we have.
And I think that's a great point, Roger. I mean, several great points, but you have to ask those questions, right? You have to, because if we don't, we're not doing the right things, and we know it, right? So, all right. So one more question that I have, and then we're going to open it. We're going to open up the floor for general questions. So Michelle, I want to turn back to you to start us off on this question. We tend to experience life in waves. You have ups and downs, but overall your experiences are in a constricted range. Once in a while, you have truly extraordinary experiences. Whether the experience was good or bad, talk about something that was truly out of the ordinary.
When I hear a question like that, there's one experience that comes to mind immediately, and it probably was one of the most awesome things I got to work on in my life, because it was a combination of security privacy, tech, public policy, and democracy. And so, right, democracy, where did that come from? So I used to be the product manager of the Google Transparency Report, which is a website that we traditionally use to put out data about government overreach and security and privacy topics, as well as like content removal from Google systems due to terms of service violations or laws in different countries that required us to kind of hide content in certain scenarios. And as part of the Russia meddling in the US elections through the online advertising business, the Google decided to create a transparency report on our political advertisers, as well as the ads themselves, the political ads that run on our system, to give that, I think we talked about transparency before, but to really bring transparency into the process, because there was calls all across Congress to say, like, we need more transparency into who's putting these ads out there and influencing the American public court of opinion, right? And if they are legitimately doing so. And so that was the opportunity to work with people in Congress. We worked with advertisers. We worked with people, advocacy organizations, and just to understand all of the different things that they were facing, from misinformation to data quality, to like understanding how the advertising business even worked and how people were able to get it out there and what should be the appropriate governance perspectives there. It was just a really amazing opportunity just to see how all of those things could come together in one project, where that we could land a report that we thought struck a really good balance between respecting the democracy, the advocacy organizations and what Congress needed, as well as respecting the advertisers in our business, who were really concerned that we might, unleash some of their secret sauce as we started to release this information.
Wow, that is definitely extraordinary. So thank you for sharing that. That's really exciting that that Google, I assume they still do it.
Yeah, actually, it's expanded, and so it's a global report from elections all across the world, and not just the United States anymore.
Wow, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I know I keep using that word, but everybody's responses have been really fantastic. So I know we have some general questions from our attendees. So Casey, do you want to pose those for us?
Yeah, thanks, Christy. Thanks so much to all of you. I'm learning so much. I want to go and get trained in the cloud, even though I have no technical experience whatsoever. So this has been truly a great ongoing event. So first question we have is about the challenges of consolidating logs and implement correlation. Facing a lot of them with every tool or third-party solution, it seems to get, they seem to get overwhelmed with the quantity. So what are some of the ways to architect the logging solution and process that might help reduce the quantity issue?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. It's a problem. All the providers out there, they're going to let us capture logs and whatever, and that's simple. But that is the question. What are we going to do with all those logs and all those things? If you move in the incident response spaces, you're going to need to. The solution here is you have to spend some time tuning. This is not too different from what we've been doing on premise historically, where you have a SIEM solution and you turn it on with the default rules and whatnot, and that may work for you. For a lot of people, that doesn't work. You're going to have to spend some time understanding your data, your logs. What do you care about? Do you care to receive alerts about port 80? 443 being exposed, things like that. If that's something that you care about, sure, that's a use case. If not, go ahead and tune it out or something like that. We're gonna need to spend that time going through our use cases, understanding how things happen. How does data move? How does authentication happen? How do system A talk to system B? All of those things. When you understand all the path of the data and all the different parts, that's when you're going to be able to develop those use cases that are going to allow you to get rid of that noise. It's a problem, again, but we do have to spend the time. It's not an easy task. If you are maybe a smaller shop, you may need to bring a consultant to do this, because it's very time consuming, but you pay the price up front by making sure you refine your use cases to avoid all that eternal noise of things that are going to be of low value to you.
Can I interject into that?
Absolutely, yes. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much for bringing those things up. You're absolutely right about the fact that there's a lot of noise out there. I think about a traditional IT environment where you have all kinds of devices, your IDS, your IPS, and all of these things spewing logs at you, and your routers and switches and all of that. And in a traditional IT environment, we tend to already ignore it. So shifting to the cloud, it's really easy to be overwhelmed with those noises and just ignore it. But the risks are much greater. And so it's important to try to figure out tools that can help you within your cloud environment. For instance, if you're talking about AWS, we know something like, we know about CloudWatch. CloudWatch enables us to understand what's going on in terms of resources. It gives us reporting on health and performances, but it's extremely noisy and it's not entirely intuitive. And so there's a way you can basically streamline those logs and put it into CloudTrail and be able to make sense of it intuitively. So it's important to either utilize the native solution available to you or consult with a third-party solution that allows you to ingest those logs and make sense of them and even be able to action out on them. And so that's one thing I wanted to add to that.
Excellent. Thanks so much for that, Niles and Roger, for great response there. Another question from attendees: as an IT vendor risk manager who monitors my third-party vendors, what questions can I ask to test their security in the cloud, and what should my responses to their answers be?
So I'm happy to take this one. So we talked about this a little bit. When the key things that you want to ask them are going to be around whatever risk framework that you've chosen. I think you're going to want to look at, and I'm going to talk primarily from like a security and privacy background, because I don't have as much other background in other areas of the cloud. But the things that you're going to want to look at is data access. I think one of the biggest sticking points that a lot of customers have is, because I'm moving from on-prem where I control all the operations, right? I know who's accessing my data. I know the way that they're doing it. I can tell you like what processes they use, whether they have to use multi-factor authentication to access the data. I can tell you what type of perimeter security that I've set up. I can talk about what the physical access is to it, to the data. I can control kind of my own insider risk posture. When you move to a cloud provider, you're actually sharing that. And the question that comes up is, how close is your security posture in insider risk to mine, right? So that I can know that you're doing some of the same things that I would do with that same data had it still been on-prem where I can control it. And so you'll see questions, so you should ask questions about like, how do you do physical access into the data center? What are the processes for like support, support engineers, for site reliability engineers, all the people who could possibly have access to that data? How do they go about getting that access? Is there a multi-party approval system? Is there multi-factor authentication? What type of device can they access it from? How do you know that that device is trusted? You know, what type of monitoring do you do around that access? And so that's a really big one, I think, that comes up quite a bit. And those are the kind of questions that you should be asking your cloud provider, and making sure that you have a good understanding of it. And a lot of people, to mitigate that risk, is they leverage encryption. And if you're going to be leveraging encryption to mitigate the risk of someone, data leaking and someone getting access to data that they're not supposed to, then you need to understand, like, if you're using the cloud provider's encryption mechanism, how secure is that? How are the keys generated? Who has access to the keys? Can anybody besides me decrypt my data, right? Those are the kind of things that you'll also have to ask when it comes to access. The other thing that comes up quite a bit is, like, how do you monitor your own security posture? Because cloud providers will say things like, we use this type of hardware and to maintain hardware security. And most cloud providers, if they're good, they will have a multi-layer security approach. That's hardware, software, network. They'll have multiple layers of it. And you want to understand, like, how do you monitor and how do you do incident management? And how will I be made aware of an incident that happens that can impact my customers or impact my workload and availability? Those are the type of questions that you also have to ask, because, as mentioned before, you want to make sure not only that they're technically sound and have the right technical controls, but you also want to make sure they have the right operational controls and that they're continuously monitoring and keeping that up to date. And then I think the final thing that you should ask as a customer when evaluating a cloud provider is, how do you help me with my part of the shared responsibility model, as we mentioned earlier? For example, if let's say I live in Europe, right? And I think a lot of us have probably dealt with GDPR at some point, right? And you may have some needs where data has to remain in Europe and data regionalization. How do you help me store my data in region, right? How do you help me classify my data so I know what's personal data and what's not? What are the tools that are available on top of your platform to ensure that data doesn't leak when an email goes out or when I have data moving across the wire? These are the things that you want to know. Like, do you have controls that I can use and turn my risk knobs up and down as I need? So those are some of the questions that I think you should dig into with your cloud provider.
That was such a thorough response. Thank you so much, Michelle. We have 2 questions remaining that I hope to get in these last 4 minutes. Compared with the traditional incident response procedure, what components should be added into cloud incident response procedure?
I can probably jump on this one. So a couple key components here. I'd say make sure you have the right tooling for cloud-specific incident response. But then beyond that, when it comes to the nitty-gritty of how an organization should best prepare for a cloud-based incident, the big challenge for me to give real broad-based answers is that it's going to be different based on each organization. It's going to be different based on your relationship with with your cloud provider. It's going to be different based on the type of data you have stored in your cloud environment and how you're using it and how it interacts with your business continuity. So I'd say that it's beyond saying, make sure you have the right tools in place for incident response and make sure that you have cloud-specific incident response plans in place that involve interacting with your cloud provider in some capacity. It's difficult to provide really in-depth, detailed analysis without looking from kind of an organization to organization level. But I think taking the time as an organization to get that specificity and really dig deep into your cloud-based incident response, I think will be a time well spent for the organization.
Yeah, I just want to add something quickly.
Go ahead.
It's right on. We have to understand exactly what's happening in our cloud. Part of how we're going to achieve that is going to be doing something like game days or something like that, sort of a capture the flag or something like that, hands-on tabletops, whatever you want to call it. But you have to put your people who are the responders out there on the cloud. Of course, don't do it in production because that's never fun. Have a lab or something where they can go and touch this stuff. Everything looks fine on paper until something happens, and you have to go ahead and grab a snapshot or make some change or something, or isolate a virtual machine or something like that in the cloud. It all looks good on paper, but you need to do that first phase of the process preparation. You need to play ahead, plan ahead, play ahead of something happening, do it before something happens, because you must be ready. And when something happens, it's not the time to be trying to figure out how to use the tools. So just make sure everybody's aware of that.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off of what both of them are saying, I think one of the key things that people have to really understand is the logs. When you move to the cloud, like the logs are key to being able to do like digital forensics and understand what happened and to go back and replay a scenario and figure it out. And some of the issues is that people are used to looking at logs and interpreting logs in their own front system, and then they get it from the cloud provider and they don't know how to make heads or tails of it, right? And if you're in a multi-cloud scenario, as someone said before, it could be even harder because AWS logs may not look like Azure logs, which may not look like GCP logs. And so the same things that you were used to looking in at one cloud provider, you may be looking for it in a different way. And so being able to test and make sure that the container logs that you get from one system, maybe you're using Docker versus the GKE container logs that you're getting from GCP, that those logs have the data that you need to be able to do those investigations. It's going to be really key, because if you have the right tools, but you're not feeding it the right data, then you also won't be able to kind of get the threat intelligence that you need to understand what happened and to be able to come up with some control that will prevent it in the future.
And I want to add to that, because this is a definitely hot topic here that you brought up here. I want to add, maybe give me 30 seconds or so. So personally in cloud security at Cisco, I can share this with you guys that, when you're talking about incident response, we actually level our tools to do that. One of the things we want to know is that, first of all, do you even know every entity that's available in your environment? Do you see every conversation that's going on in your environment? Do you understand what's normal? Are you alerted when something changed? Are you able to respond to a threat and take action immediately? At Cisco, we use what's called Secure Cloud Analytics that allows us to do this. And this is just one of the tools, like Michelle was talking about. There are several tools that we use, and we do this tabletop exercises. So definitely it's important to have a thorough cloud visibility in terms of posture for what you have.